Hello everyone. My name's Oni Anyukam and I am the campaigns manager at Creative Commons. I joined the CC team back in July, so I'm a newbie and this is my first CC Global Summit. I'm so excited to be meeting new faces and I'm incredibly honored to be moderating this panel for the next hour. On the panel, we will have, and we currently have three incredible leaders and experts right at the helm of digital openness. And I will give them some time to conduct introductions and share some initial remarks. But just to give you a flavor of how the conversation will go, we'll kick off with our initial remarks, giving each panelist an opportunity to share their perspectives and the angle that they're coming into the conversation with. And then we will open the floor with some moderated questions. We have the Q&A function on the right-hand side. I encourage you to start thinking about questions. It's not often that we get to sit down with such incredible experts. I know that I've been scribbling away a few questions earlier today. I will take privilege of my moderating duties and try to squeeze them in, but we want to get to as many questions as possible. So please drop your questions in the Q&A. And with that, we can start off with introductions. I think we'll go Brianna, Coraline, Danelle, and then hopefully Marta will be with us. So Brianna, off to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brianna Marbury. I am the Executive Director of the Interledger Foundation. At the Interledger Foundation, we are focused on being advocates and stewards of the Interledger Protocol, which is a currency agnostic open payments network. And in addition to holding the standards and the trademarks and patents of the protocol, we also have a programming arm where you may have heard of Grant for the Web is one of our programs that focuses on web monetization. And we also are doing research into a lot of open payments and we'll be building a program from that as well. My background is in accounting and finance, and I have spent many years in the foundation and nonprofit space. So while I would say a newbie to the payments space, I've been at the foundation for a year, which is how long we've been in operation for, and it's been great so far. So I'm really happy to be on this panel, looking forward to our discussions, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Coraline, over to you.
Hi. My name is Coraline Edemke. My background is in software engineering. I was a software engineer for 26 years. And I recently, in 2019, as a result of what I see as a humanitarian crisis, I created the Hippocratic license, which is an ethical license for open source. And I launched the ethical source movement, which this year we have professionalized into the Organization for Ethical Source. So I'm a co-founder and executive director. And the work we do is primarily in the open source domain, but we do collaborate with other leaders in the digital commons space. And our mission is about empowering open source developers to exercise their conscience and to take responsibility not only for their intentions, but the impact of our work on the broader world.
Thank you. And Danelle?
Thank you. It's so great to be here. Thank you for asking me to be part of this panel. It's such a lot of fun. I've been working in the open for a really long time. I'm the CEO and executive director of the Stellar Development Foundation. And the Stellar Development Foundation is a nonprofit entity that shepherds the code base for the Stellar Network, which is an open public blockchain network. We're extremely interested in open source development. I take openness to the core in terms of focusing on not just openness in the code base, but also openness and transparency in what we do at the foundation and how we communicate with our community. I think it's a really important part of being open. the SDF, we're sitting at the intersection of powerful technology that can address the problems of financial inclusion. Our mission is actually creating equitable access to the global financial system. Anyone can build on Stellar from anywhere in the world, and folks do. We have the opportunity to extend and improve the existing global financial system really through interoperability. So we're not looking to supplant the financial infrastructure that exists today. In fact, we're looking to interoperate with it and to enhance it. So there are 1.7 billion people around the world that are unbanked and underbanked. And so the focus that we have is to provide those folks with the opportunities that I think some of us take for granted in terms of being a part of the financial infrastructure. And we use the Stellar Network and all the wonderful companies that build on it to be able to support that. The deep roots that I have in open source, I was the COO of the Mozilla Corporation for many years and worked there for many years in different roles. And so a lot of what I learned about openness and open source and focusing on the need to be transparent came from my days there. And now it's deeply a part of the work that I like to be able to pursue at SDF, but also just in terms of like how I'd like to advocate for openness, interoperability, transparency, all those things that are deeply rooted in the early days of the web. I think we can do on the payment side of the web as well.
One thing that I, saw as I was preparing to moderate this panel discussion is that you're all coming to the conversation with such rich and diverse expertise, but one theme kind of kept on popping up for me, and this was the concept of self-determination. And I wonder, what digital self-determination means to you all and how that shows up in the work that you do. Open.
Well, so I'll just start by talking about the SDF and what we do there in terms of self-determination. I love that concept. I think one of the things that we focus on is building local and having, back in the early days of the web, so much of the technology was focused on Silicon Valley, and it didn't take into account all of the ideas and needs and problems and challenges that others in the world faced, mostly because it's really hard to be able to know that unless you live in those geographies. And so much of what we try to do and what I love about our work is that we're working with folks to solve local problems, but they're actually the ones coming up with not just what those problems are, but also what those solutions are. And I think that that's a really important part of it. So we fund a lot of folks and we provide whatever grants that we can from the foundation to support them. And also we just work with them on helping them to build their technologies and to solve the problems that they know that exist in their region that we might not find that are similar to where we live. And so that's one of the things that I love about the work and working in the open and being able to have an open source platform, that it allows so much opportunity for innovation and growth at the local level.
Yeah, when I think about self-determination in the digital space, I think about all of the organizations that have popped up, like the mobile money providers that have popped up, because there was a need for people to be able to transact digitally where they weren't able to, where they were being ignored by banks, and they didn't have a way to transact with each other. So these organizations have come in to fill the gaps where they have been ignored. And so how our work fits into that is like, yes, this is great that you're filling a gap, but right now they're all siloed networks, and you cannot participate in the network unless you are on that particular, are using that particular company. And so at the Interledger Foundation, we're trying to get people to work together so that they can be interoperable with each other and not just work with people who are in the same networks. And also that would allow them to do cross-border transactions, which could really help to improve some of the economies in the areas that we're looking at.
I would say in my work, we are bringing a slightly different focus to the practice of open source beyond what is traditionally practiced, in that traditional open source is very focused on adopters. And something that we are trying to normalize is thinking beyond adopters to the people who are impacted by the technology that we create, often without their consent. So our focus is a little less on self-determination of other engineers and more focused on creating safety for the people upon whom software is used. And a lot of what we do as well is collaboration with organizations from around the world. We're especially interested in collaborations in the global south to counteract the I don't want to say the word libertarianism, but to counteract the libertarianism that Silicon Valley ethos imposes on the rest of the world in the form of digital colonization and digital extractivism. So we are very focused on justice and equity, and that includes things like self-designation, informed consent, data autonomy, but all modulated by hopefully universally recognized norms and rights.
Awesome, thank you. Some great themes coming out there. I want to move the conversation over a little bit and pick up on the topics of financial inclusion, privacy, and creative business models. Now, I've got a few starter questions just to kind of kick things off, but if you want to bring any other views in, please do. My first question is, do you see any tensions with the ethics of private financial transactions? And then leading on from that, what about anonymous support around those financial what about anonymous support around those financial transactions? Gosh, can't get my words out right. And then, you know, if I was to head downstairs and go to my mailbox right now and I found $5,000, what thoughts should I be having? And if we threw that into the digital space, should I be having those same thoughts or, you know, anything different?
It's such an interesting concept when I think about blockchain and how that question relates to blockchain, because ironically, blockchain is at once the most private and then also the most public, because it's distributed ledger technology. That means that everyone can see the transactions, but you can't see who's creating those transactions. You just have the address for it. So I think that that's a really interesting dichotomy in terms of thinking about it. In terms of like the centralized and the private financial transactions, I think the challenge that I have with those is mostly related to this notion of financial inclusion and how many people are excluded from the traditional financial infrastructure because they don't have a certain amount of cash to put in the bank, or because they work outside the traditional infrastructure that some of us work in. And women are often mostly excluded from the traditional, to be able to get bank accounts, for example. You don't have the proper identification or something like that, or the fees are so high that it just eats the whole in terms of the principal. And so when I think about like the centralized and the focus on the private, I think the notion of blockchain and the idea and what a lot of these really phenomenal institutions that are building on top of Stellar are really focused on is providing opportunity, for example, for someone in Mexico to be able to receive funds from their family who happen to be working in California, for example, and they can convert those funds into digital assets here in California, send them over to their family in Mexico, and they can use those assets to either hold them so that they actually have an account. It's not like a bank account, but it's an account where they have their money instead of putting it somewhere in their house. And then they can use that to be able to pay their utilities, or they can actually do this through Bicos is an entity that builds on Stellar that you can actually do this with. So these are opportunities to really engage and to create so that because right now the financial institutions are really built for the few, and this is actually bringing in for the many, and it allows people to engage at every level. And so from my standpoint, I think that that's the real, I don't think that there's anything wrong with centralized systems for that. I just think that there's a lot of exclusionary tactics that may not be intended. They're just focused on regulatory environment or other things or risk assessments, but blockchain allows that not to be the case.
Yeah, Danelle, we run into a lot of the same issues, seeing that our organizations are so similar. And I would say, in addition to what Danelle said, we look at like issues with KYC, knowing your customer, where a lot of digital wallets require even forget about having a bank account. If you want to get a digital wallet, you still have to go through all these different steps and submit documentation, again, of ID that you might not have if you want to do transactions above a certain amount. So that serves as a financial a barrier to allowing people to gain digital financial access. So when thinking about privacy, because a lot of people have been discussing digital ID and what does that look like and how can that be added? Well, if you don't have an ID and can't get established on these systems, you're still left out. So what does it look like if we have like a KYC light for some organizations to add on there? So those are some of the issues that we've been exploring and trying to figure out a solution to.
I don't do any work in this particular space, but I think there are some kind of universal principles that that we have to think about and that we have to address. I did see a statistic that I think 35% of women in the world don't have access to financial instruments. That works out to almost 1 billion women. I also think an important part of globalization of technology is understanding different trust models in different parts of the world. In the Western world, trust is very transactional, and in a lot of other places in the world, trust has to be earned, and trust is more of a community factor. I do worry that a lot of the solutions, and I'm not being critical of either of you, but solutions in this space have a high barrier to entry and don't address issues of trust. And something I like to say is that institutions, those with power, have to extend trust by default, but they themselves have to earn the trust through their actions and through the visible impact that they're having on the world. The other thing I just wanted to mention is I think missing from some of these conversations, and again, not talking about Danilo or Brianna, but what's often missing in conversations like this is, for example, what's happening with sex workers in the US. We have sites like OnlyFans, which, due to the pressure of the credit card industry, is now ejecting sex workers from the platform. So I think that economic justice also has to apply to people on the fringes.
Yeah, I actually just love what you just said. I think one of the things that's really important, blockchain itself is supposed to be this trustless mechanism where you don't actually have to trust any entity. But the truth of the matter is, when it gets down to the individuals that are providing either custodial or non-custodial wallets, they're a brand that the end user has to get comfortable with. And that's why one of the things that I love is focusing on the local building. So building local, building with the needs of the local audience in mind and focusing there, we can help to support and to shepherd the code base for this global network. But I can't tell you what the needs are everywhere in the world. But I can tell you that there are people who do know, and that those people, when given the opportunity, can solve the problems better than I can. And so from that standpoint, the trust mechanism, and I love the way you said that because it is so true. It is culturally different. It is different in each community. It is like, it's different even in terms of, you know, whether people are if it's a peer-to-peer network, they're sometimes more comfortable because they can see that they know who they're engaging with. And I think taking all of these considerations into play when you're building something locally is really the thing that I think people do when given the opportunity to build to solve problems in their geographies.
Brianna, did you have anything to add there?
No, I totally agree with both of them.
Awesome. And I can see in the chat from Zach, my understanding is that there's also a significant global gap in internet access and usage for women, and not just women as well. Access to the internet is political, and you know it's not equitable at the moment, and that's something that separately we have to strive for in order for people to leverage these technologies.
Well, I do think that that's a really important point, because if you think about internet access, that the idea behind so many of these solutions and the solutions that are actually taking root and growing in these different smaller regions is they're really focused on not needing to have internet connection, but needing to have a mobile device that could be a super low end mobile device that you can put a wallet on. So it is the need for technology, but recognizing, and this, I spent years at Mozilla advocating for, internet access to the internet and believing that that's a fundamental right, that it's actually not a privilege. And I think that's the challenge, is that it's still sometimes viewed or used as a privilege, and it shouldn't be. So I do think that most of these technologies that are locally built and that are focused on we have one that, and I just love it. I'll just say, like, this company called Leaf Global, it's focused on refugees in Africa and focused on sub-Saharan Africa, where the problem that they have is they get excluded from their countries for sometimes years at a time. And when they're traveling across the border, carrying their cash or carrying their fiat in their hands is actually really dangerous for them. And so Leaf Global focuses on using their wallet to be able to convert into digital and to cross these borders seamlessly and still have access to all of the assets that they had when they left. So these are things that we might not consider here. But yet it's a really important and significant issue and can be done on a low-end device. That is how we actually get people access to these tools, when we're focused on ensuring that we don't need all of the things that we might have access to in certain regions, in all the regions globally.
Could I just modulate that a bit? I have a friend in India who's actually part of our organization, and the Indian government is using rolling internet blackouts as a coercive tool, and they have pretty significant programs of surveillance. It is literally not safe for me to have a conversation with him about the political situation in India. And I think that safety has to be a key concern, especially if we're talking about low-end devices, simple devices. If you're running an Android phone, you're consenting to a certain amount of digital surveillance and data collection. The same thing with an Apple iPhone, which again is maybe it's more high-end phone. But there are very few platforms in which you're not coerced into trading autonomy for ergonomics, frankly. And I think that's a problem that we really need to address. And there's a potential for open source there, but it has to be open source that has not been co-opted by tech giants and by companies whose entire business model is based on the violation of privacy.
And one thing I've been wondering is what a marriage of centralized systems and decentralized systems looks like. Just kind of picking up from where you left off, I guess, on this, Danelle, I think, more and more centralized financial institutions are trying to leverage new technologies and, get involved in the hype, I would say. What does that look like in terms of, perfect equilibrium working together towards our kind of global financial inclusion?
So for me, I feel, and I think it's because of my early days in the web and remembering, for example, like in privacy and what we did in the early days is we said, government, we don't need you. We can take care of this ourselves. We know how to self-regulate. And of course, look where we are today, where maybe we didn't know so much about self-regulation and creating that standard. But the one thing we did really wrong on the content side of the web is we actually didn't have this openness and this. We had a lot of, we have like 5 companies that essentially control the content globally. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things we need to do on the payment side of the web and the financial side of the web, whatever you want to call it, is really focus on that interoperability. Centralized systems can be completely fine and folks can derive a lot of value to them. But when they're completely closed loop and when they're trying to own the whole and you're not actually allowing the engagement, what happens is, again, it's built for the few and not for the many. So it actually eliminates the notion of being able to create financial inclusion, because it's going to just be for the folks who have, non-custodial wallets, for example, where you might not need you don't need the KYC. You can just create a wallet and hold your assets there. Aren't something that centralized systems are going to really go for, because you can't do a whole lot. You might not even know who your customer is in that moment. So you really have to think about these centralized systems in an interoperable way. So they have to interoperate with larger technologies that are out there. I think all blockchains should be interoperable, and you can create that interoperability, by the way, by having the assets be able to flow between them. Circle, who's an entity that issues a USD-backed token, they actually have their token reside on many different blockchains today. And the reason why they do that is because then you have access to it and you have access to the benefits that each of them offer. So if blockchains can interoperate through that, then we should be able to get that interoperability with these centralized systems as well. So this is an important thing for me. It's like one of the things that I hammer home all the time is that I don't think that there needs to be a clear winner. There needs to be this interoperability layer that we envisioned at the start of the web. We still have it for the underlying technology, but we actually weren't able to completely accomplish it when it came to the content side, and we need to really focus on that here.
Well, I will turn the conversation over to a topic that's coming up again and again through Summit and just generally at the moment, and that's NFTs. I'd love to gather your perspectives on, are they here to stay? What do you think about them? And how can they be used to support, creative business models in the future, if at all?
Well, I think NFTs are really interesting. I just saw recently where Doja Cat, the performer, she is signing up for NFTs and just sold her first for, I think, 188,000, but she really doesn't understand what NFTs are. And a lot of people just don't really understand what NFTs are, but I think that they give you a really good opportunity for artists to start building and making money off of their work. Everybody seems to be jumping into it, including all of the celebrities. I believe that it's here to stay because it offers an alternative way for artists and performers to be able to monetize their work. So I think that they're here to stay.
I think that as with everything with this technology, it's a pretty cool thing that's been able to really engage and create that financial inclusion for the creator economy. I mean, we all know that actually artists have a really hard time engaging globally with folks to be able to sell their work, and they can do so now. So I think that the notion of being able to do this on a global basis is pretty cool. I think that, when it's on networks like Stellar, for example, there are other networks out there too where the transaction fees are low. There's a real opportunity to be able to generate revenue for these artists. So I love the fact that it's really responding and allowing a segment of these creators to be able to put something together and to engage in this financial system in a way historically they couldn't. So I think that's pretty cool. Here to stay. This technology literally changes every single day. So I think it probably is, but it might morph into something else and be something completely different in the next year, which is what I love about this space, but it's also really hard.
I'm a musician. As you see behind me, I'm actually coming to you from my studio. And I have been on the receiving end in not to an extreme degree or to a degree that affects my my lifestyle or well-being, but I've been on the receiving end of extractivism from artists. You have to be on Spotify, you have to be on Apple Music, you have to be on Google Play, and none of those platforms provide any income whatsoever. I was featured in a Spotify playlist spotlighting transgender musicians. One of my songs got about 14,000 plays, and I got $3. So I think NFTs perhaps have the potential to make that more equitable, but I see the barrier to entry so high. And what we're hearing about is all of the $1 million sales, the $180,000 sales. Well, what about a living income for artists? And honestly, NFTs feel to me like a technical solution to a social and economic problem. And I'm very skeptical of it. Anil Dash said it's like a certificate of authenticity. That's in common in Comic Sans are misspelled. So I'm pretty pessimistic about NFTs as something that that will equitably distribute compensation to the majority of artists.
We'll definitely have to watch this space. Brianna, you're on mute, but I think you were trying to add something in.
Yeah, I have a question for Coraline. So what do you think are some of the ways that we can expand the reach for more artists to be able to participate so that it is more equitable? Because when new digital solutions usually emerge, then it is one population really that benefits from it. So I'm just thinking of like ways that we could extend the reach so that it's not exclusionary, how it has been before. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm honestly not close enough to it to have any more than the opinion that I shared, which is a general observation that like we don't have a great history with supporting artists, and I'm very skeptical and suspicious of technological solutions to problems of, frankly, not valuing creative output unless it can be monetized. So I really can't answer your question because honestly, I'm not informed enough to answer your question.
Well, I'll add that we only hear and read about, or the mass public only hears and reads about the big numbers, but people are monetizing at even small numbers daily. And so I do think that there's an opportunity, and there's not a huge barrier to entry when you're actually on a network that has low fees. If it's on a network that has high fees, it has to be a really valuable NFT in order to do it. So again, I don't know, like this isn't our focus on Stellar. We're focused on payments, and we're focused on cross-border transactions and asset issuance. But there's an entity called Lightment that's built a really wonderful NFT platform on Stellar, and people are selling things every day there. And so I say more power to them if they're able to create that creative economy and to be able to do that. And again, I do think the technology is constantly changing. And the idea that we can actually have these different opportunities built by individuals from different places is going to provide some of that source of creativity and, you know, generosity into a system that, as you say, hasn't been built to be able to protect against those things.
And it wouldn't be a panel on emerging trends in open if I didn't, you know, open it up to you and ask you about some of the emerging trends that you're seeing, you know, opportunities, issues that we should, you know, pay attention to. So I'll open it up and ask you for your top things that we should be looking at in terms of emerging trends.
Well, I don't know that the trend is emerging. I think that there is the trend for having the few control, like the content, and like the lack of interoperability is a trend that continues. And I think that what we need to do is really, really align ourselves to focus against that as users of these technologies, as folks that are engaged in this ecosystem. I really think that, you know, interoperability doesn't mean that that folks can't be successful financially if that's the choice that these companies want to make. I don't think that that's, and then frankly, many of them need to be in that way. And I think that's great. But interoperability just allows the silos to not happen so that you actually can create more and innovate more and make it so that the technologies don't fall behind. Because I think what's happened in banking, for example, for years and years and years, they're using the same software, they're using the same tools that have been available to them, and it's very antiquated. And so now we have these opportunities for these new tools. If we close them off again and we make it so that there's not interoperability, we're actually going to create another problem for the next generation 70, 100 years from now that's going to be dealing with the things that we created and not the things that are interoperable at that time. So I do think that that's one of the most important trends that I'd like to see continue to happen, with a real focus on that in terms of the financial side of the web. And of course, to the extent that we can bridge between all the different silos on the content side, I'd love that too.
Yeah, I see with the banks, the interoperability and financial inclusion, that seems to be like the buzzword that's going on, going around town now. And I think a big part of it is that the banks realize that the emerging market is worth $12 trillion because that's what has gone through the money mobile providers last year. It's $12 trillion for this population of, like I said, 1.3 to 1.7 billion people who are unbanked. And so a lot of the central banks are focusing on how do we become interoperable? How do we capture this market that we've been missing out on? And a big piece of it is becoming so that they can talk with each other and being interoperable.
So my perspective, again, for more of the on the open source side and less on the financial side, I think that I'm reminded of what was his name? I can't remember Herbert Schiller. He wrote a paper in 1976 that warned of a future where the lives of people around the globe would be influenced and shaped by a handful of Western media companies. And I think in the 90s, we saw that happen with tech giants stepping in. And open really was intended to be an antidote to that, to prevent the dystopia from becoming a reality. And the theory was that simply by providing open access, that would solve the problem. But in reality, things that we don't really acknowledge is that not everyone can freely access, not everyone can use or modify, and not everyone can safely share. Again, coming back to my music, I was doing a piece on how the massive protests of last year were being mediated by cell phone cameras, police body cameras, and video cameras, with a special focus on racial justice activism. And this project is completely open. I release everything under a Creative Commons license. And so I went to the Wiki Commons to find video footage that we could use in our video. And when my video producer came back and showed me his work in progress, there were 2 Black folks in the entire video. And I went to him, I'm like, what's going on? Why is it happening? And he said, that's all there was on Wiki Commons. And I thought about that for a moment and realized that for a lot of Black folks in America, it is not safe to have a picture of your face associated with a protest like that. And I think safety is something that we don't think about in the open movement. And I think that's a source of a lot of injustice and a lot of technologically empowered injustices. And I think that we really need to start thinking beyond open and beyond our intentions and looking at the real impact of the work that we're doing. And that is something that goes against the status quo. And that is something that a lot of people have a very visceral reaction against. But I think we need to modulate our idealism with some realism.
And that leads perfectly into my next question. The open movement is at a bit of an inflection point. We've seen this week a lot of conversations around the kind of dichotomy of open and privacy. We had the paradox of open session earlier on today with some great conversations around some of the challenges we're facing at that point. And I wanted to get your thoughts, wanted you to think out loud a little around how the open movement needs to kind of adapt to the changing times that we see. And I think it was Derek that said this in the earlier session, the paradox of open, that open really began as a yes and. It was never meant to be, the sole bread and butter of everything, but rather an add-on to the system that we had in place. So I wonder what your thoughts are around some of these conversations.
Well, I think that and this goes back to a lot of my years focusing on openness, transparency, privacy, interoperability. So much of the way the web was created was focused on that anonymity. And that anonymity was something that was actually supposed to be protective. The challenge, of course, is what's happened over time is that anonymity on the web is actually the thing that's become created environments that aren't safe, because people wouldn't say things that they say on the web and they wouldn't say them to you in person if they recognize that there's a person on the other side of that. And sometimes I think that we forget. So I find that those challenges around privacy, security, and safety are things that not only do we actually have to pursue at the level of the technology and creating the opportunity for people to be able to communicate in a way that's protective from their governments, protective from sometimes their family, protective from, sometimes like where they work, depending on the countries that they work in. They can hide those communications and protect them from disclosure. But there's also this need for us to recognize that, and there's been all this talk for all these years of this need to be able to have these principles about how to engage on the web and with content and with other humans that are on the other side of these words that people write. And of course, none of them have ever taken root because it's a cultural difference in every region. And that's the nature of the global part, makes it so that we have to understand that not everyone sees things the way that we do. Not everyone sees privacy the way that I do. And now I don't even see privacy the same way for my children that I see it for myself. So I think that these are really complicated social and cultural issues that can't be solved by technology. And so I think that the movement to open, I love it, because I think it actually, we used to always say, you can audit our code, you can see what we're doing. Like, those are really important things, but there is this added layer that we need to be thinking about, to Coraline's points, like that we need to be thinking about from society and how to engage safely. There's a whole lot there, and I spent years focusing on these issues, and I don't know the solutions. I just know that we have to be aware that there are problems, and that we have to teach our children and teach our family and teach our friends all of these different issues that those of us that might have more education on, that we can share. But it's very complicated and very challenging. And this global technology has allowed us to be able to see the world in different ways. And then sometimes, because of the content, we see the world in the same way, which is not actually what we intended when we first started it.
I have a very interesting experience with identity on the internet. I got online for the first time, I believe in 1993 or 1994. And in those days, IRC and BBSs were primary ways that we communicated with each other. And as a transgender woman, as a transgender person who is closeted, I was able to explore different ways of interacting and explore my gender in an online space in a safe way, because I didn't have to be the same person everywhere. And what we see today is federated identity. And federated identity has some benefits, but we trade a lot for that. And I'm also on the receiving end of a lot of anonymous abuse, starting in 2014 when I created the Contributor Covenant. I still get death threats. I still get people emailing me anonymously, encouraging me to kill myself. Linux.org got hijacked in 2017 after the Linux core team adopted Contributor Covenant with my docs information. Since 2014, there's only been one 6-month period where abusers and harassers did not know my home address. And so I've seen both sides of anonymity. I've seen the good and the ugly. And it comes down to safety. I think it really comes down to safety and interoperability, like you were talking about, Danelle, I think is very important. I think we need to get over the adversarial notion of open versus proprietary, which is a highly charged subject in open source, and recognize that there is a proprietary internet and there is an open internet, and they must interact. But the focus on open source alternatives has to be ethical, it has to be equitable, it has to be safe, and it also has to have low barriers to entry. I remember I was doing some research on on something called Swadesh List. I'm interested in artificial languages, and Wiktionary had a page on this, and there was a table of Swadesh words. The instructions on Wiktionary literally say, to sort the table columns here, copy the JavaScript link from this URL. And once you've come back to this page, paste the JavaScript code into your URL window to run it. That JavaScript code, which is on Wiktionary.org, is pointing to a private personal blog of an ex-Firefox engineer in California named Jesse Ruderman. So we have to trust Jesse Ruderman with code that, first of all, most people won't be able to follow those instructions. Secondly, even if they are able to follow those instructions, they have no notion of safety. And I think that's just so representative of how we design open source technologies to extend rights to other engineers and not further downstream, thinking about the people for whom we want these resources to be a non-commercial alternative. And I think that is a massive failure. Even with open source alternatives to a lot of video conferencing, that was super important, will remain super important. Word processors, all of these things, there's no accessibility. There's no kind of sense of user experience or designing humane interfaces. There's no ergonomics. And yet we're telling people, especially in the open source world, not to use proprietary tools, to instead seek out open source tools. And they're only accessible to people with a not only digital literacy, but digital fluency. I think we need to stop building things for other engineers and other technologists and focus on the people we're trying to help.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Danelle, you're on mute. I completely agree with that. And I like Danelle's idea of going local. We need to talk to people. Like engineers will build something like, oh, this is really cool, let's roll this out. But it might not have a practical use for anyone to be able to use it. So I totally agree that we need to look from the ground up instead of a top-down approach when we're talking about building the new technologies. And as far as the safety, I mean, I'm sorry that that's something that you have to go through. It's just incomprehensible. And where do we find the balance at between allowing people to have, you know, freedoms and being able to say what they want, have that openness, but also being able to protect people so where it's not harmful? Because we can see where there are just so many different harmful things going on. When we look at the election and how that was used, openness, people can hide behind being anonymous and say whatever they want to say and create false identities. So how do we find the balance in between people's rights and also protecting them from harmful practices?
Yeah, I'll just end by saying that from my standpoint, the idea when I was at Mozilla, we always tried to use open source technologies. To bring a closed source piece of technology into Mozilla was a very challenging thing. It's also challenging at SDS because we're so focused on the open. But sometimes because the user interface is not the thing that the developers focus on, it is a necessary part. So I think that the call to action from an open standpoint, in addition to the safety, in addition to thinking about anonymity and how to use it for good and not for evil, we have to think about UX design. We have to think about engagement. We have to think about the simplicity to allow everyone to be able to engage, not just people with high-end computers, not just people that understand technology. We can't just build technology for exactly. You can't just use technology for technology's sake. You've got to build for the humans that you want to, or the humans or other developers that you want to interact with it. So I love all of that. That's like the beautiful thing about open is that you can do that. The challenge is that you don't get a lot of developers focused on that piece. So that's the CTA from my standpoint.
Could I say one more thing on that? I'm sorry. I see, I talked about the proprietary internet and the open internet. The proprietary internet coerces us into yielding agency and privacy in exchange for ergonomics. In order to fully use a system, you have to pay or you have to yield data. or you have to read a EULA that is written in legalese. A friend of mine, actually a colleague of mine at OES, defines ergonomics as the marriage of ethics and design. And I think there's a horrible thing happening on the proprietary internet with that, but in the open source world, the barrier to entry is that we're requiring technical fluency in exchange for ergonomics, which I think is just as much of a problem.
Thanks for those reflections. I've just done a quick time check and I don't know where the last 51 or 52 minutes have gone. I want to get to some of the audience questions, and if anyone has any questions, now's the moment to slip them in the chat. But we do have 2 questions to get us started before we round up. The first is from Vahid, and it is, how do we build a worldwide global authority system that can regulate financial interactions with a focus on inclusion? Is that a possibility? What does it look like?
I would hate the idea of putting that in the hands of one group, one centralized government, one group that has to, or even like a combination of all the governments. I actually believe that the way the current system operates is not problematic. Each of the companies that sit within a specific region have the regulatory requirements of that region, yet they can still engage with the global, interoperable, decentralized network. And I think that that is the way to think about this, is that you don't need any one country or one authority to control it all. You just need to make sure that the entities in each of their regions are abiding by the restrictions in those regions, and they're still engaging in an interoperable way with all the others. That's the way that I see the world.
Yeah, I think that having one authority could be very, very problematic. And when you're talking about inclusion looks different in each area of the world. So how are you going to take all of that into consideration if you just have one standards body? So I think it's really leaves open a very possible way for it to be problematic if there's just one.
And we have another question here from Derek Slater. If you had $10 billion to spend over the next 5 years in investing in open, what would you do with it?
Pay maintainers.
Great answer. Say no more.
Seriously, a lot of open source is built by cisgender heterosexual white men in Silicon Valley who have the privilege of free time and the privilege of being able to work with no compensation. And that creates a huge barrier to entry to something that we say, well, it's open. Anyone can read the source code. Well, not if you don't have a computer, not if you don't have enough literacy to use a command line tool, not if you don't have broadband access. So I think the accessibility of the community is an important part of that. I also, with OES, one of the programs that we're hoping to get funding for is for our projects, which are conducted in the open. I want to offer sponsorship to folks who want to participate in the development, design, writing content, any aspect of it, to sponsor them to be able to do that work. I'm on the board of an organization called Ruby Together, which is a nonprofit that funds infrastructure work in the Ruby ecosystem. And we try to raise money from corporations who use Ruby as their primary platform to pay underprivileged, undervalued developers a San Francisco salary to work on this infrastructure. And funding is like almost impossible to get. We are always starved for funding. The corporations who extract value from open source are not paying their fair share. And that's creating a system of elitism and exclusivity in open source that I don't think we're addressing.
Okay. Any other reflections from Brianna or Danelle? No. I'm not sure if this is such a question, but we've got one from Anna. Perhaps a system to explore universal digital basic income. And Derek adds, could we throw in universal robust healthcare? Do you see a future for a universal digital basic income? Would be nice.
Universal meaning global. I think that's a challenge. Again, like we're ignoring the idea that each culture and each country and folks in different regions have different ideas. I think it's one of the things I'll tell you that I feel like my son, who's a junior in college right now, like they're talking about these issues all the time at that age. They're focused on these issues. I do believe that the next generation has really, really got this in a place that we didn't. So I do think that these are issues that are going to kind of come up more and more around this. But I do think we need to be mindful of the fact that we're not all the same. Like we might all be humans, but everyone's different and everyone has different needs in different regions and different cultures. And so I think it's hard for us to think about it as a global piece.
And we've got 3 minutes left, so I want to give you all a chance to make some closing remarks. We can start off with Brianna.
I just want to say thank you again. I've learned a lot from both Coraline and Danelle. So thank you for having me on this panel. It's been great, and I hope that we all are able to keep in touch going from here.
Coraline?
I want to express my appreciation to Creative Commons for being one of the organizations that is bold and values-based enough to openly collaborate with the Organization for Ethical Source. There's a lot of antagonism around the work that we do. There's a lot of pushback about the notion that maybe we have a responsibility for the technologies that we create and deploy. And Creative Commons has been a wonderful partner in this, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to participate in this forum, as well as some of the other programs that Creative Commons has happening.
And now.
Yes, I'm so grateful to be a part of this. This is an awesome discussion. So many issues were covered. I think that, one of the things I constantly have to remind myself about is the fact that technology provides opportunity. We can screw it up, but we can also then fix it. And I think that the challenge that we have in front of us on the content side of the web is really trying to make that so that it is more open, more interoperable. And on the newer sides, when we're still developing this technology, we need to focus on that openness and focus on that interoperability, focus on the concerns around safety and inclusion and thinking local, and focusing on folks that are building in these different geographies and really being creative and innovative in their own right. So these are the things that I think if we could take anything away, that would be what I would love for all of us to sort of be committed to, is to still using the technology and working with the technology that's before us, but making it better.
And on behalf of Creative Commons, I just want to thank you all for your time here today, for your contributions. This has been an incredible panel, and I've learned so much. I'm looking forward to going back and rewatching it, not to see myself, but to hear all your amazing points. We're at time now, and it's just been a wonderful conversation. We can see in the chat that folks are extremely happy with how things have gone today, and thank you so much. I look forward to getting to speak to you all more, and we have a live music session now on the stage. So after a heavy conversation talking finance, let's go have a dance party. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye.